Hi, and welcome to the show. Outrage at the Opry. Country music star Morgan Wallen has apologized and repented and met with community leaders after having used a racial slur in an intoxicated, curse-filled rant caught on camera. But some are still furious that his concerts are sold out and that big venues are welcoming back. But hasn't he served his time? That's coming up. But first, a high-profile murder trial has ended in a mistrial after a bizarre twist in a South Florida courtroom. A jury apparently agreed that 27-year-old Deontay Rosales repeatedly stabbed Jill Halliburton Sue to death during a 2014 home invasion. After 6 days' deliberation, the jury came back with a guilty verdict on the lesser charge of manslaughter. But get this. When it came time for the foreperson to confirm the verdict to the judge, she couldn't do it. Here's how it went down.
Is this your verdict?
No.
Thank you. You need to go back to the jury room and continue with your deliberations.
The jury ended up deadlocked, forcing the judge to declare a mistrial. That foreperson has since spoken out, and she says she was among 9 jurors who wanted a first-degree murder conviction, but the 3 jurors were unwilling to convict Rosales of murder based on his race.
They said, I don't want to send a young black male to jail for the rest of their life or have them get the death sentence. I took a deep breath. I'm staring at the judge and at the clerk, and we're locking eyes, and I'm looking at each of one of them, and they're just waiting for my verdict of either yes, I agree, or no, and I just couldn't.
You can see there, she didn't want her face shown on camera. Prosecutors say Rosales broke into the 59-year-old's home intending to commit a burglary. When he found her inside, he tied her up and stabbed her 24 times. His DNA was found on the knife and inside the home. In 2016, he even escaped from the courthouse during a pretrial hearing. Investigators tracked him down nearly a week later. He's also accused of trying to manufacture a bogus alibi that would place him in Georgia at the time of the slaying. Jury selection for Rosales' new trial is set to begin on January the 18th. Joining me now, Brian Buckmire, attorney and host for the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime Daily, who has been covering this story. Brian, great to see you. Great to have you back. So only in one other case have I ever seen a juror refuse to confirm the verdict after sending out the verdict form. You ever seen it happen?
Actually, Dan, it happened to me on my first trial. I got a not guilty verdict, and what we're describing is when the opposing side asked to poll the jury. And so what happens is the judge will then go to each and every juror, and we may have seen that in some other cases where they say, is this your true and actual verdict? And at that point, if an individual, as this foreperson did, says this is not my verdict, you get sent back to deliberate. It's few and far between. It is bizarre in any situation. But like I've said, in one of the about dozen trials I've done, I've seen it happen once.
Now, Brian, jurors have a lot of latitude, right? They're kind of allowed to do what they will back in the jury room. If her account is true, though, would you characterize this as improper conduct by the jurors?
Yes, I would actually say it's an improper, not necessarily focusing on the race, but the fact that they're focusing on the sentence. And any judge, every judge throughout every county and state that I've seen at least, will tell the jury that they cannot consider the punishment when deliberating on the charges. They should only think of the elements and whether or not the prosecution has proven each and every element beyond a reasonable doubt. The idea that they're even considering the punishment for a defendant would make it a runaway jury or an improper jury or improper deliberation, however you want it to characterize it.
And the prosecutors, though, can't do anything about it, right? I mean, if this was the reverse, the defense could certainly ask for, the charges to be dismissed, et cetera. But from the prosecutor's perspective, they just got to retry it.
Correct. That's just the way the criminal justice system works in terms of recourse. You've outlined it perfectly, that if this was the opposite way around, that there could have been a different recourse for a criminal defendant to try to get a new trial or get the charges wiped away. But as you said there, the prosecution's only recourse is to do a retrial. Now, they could have negotiated a plea tried to say, hey, this seemed a little difficult to get a conviction the first time around. But I think because of the reasoning for the mistrial, I could see why a prosecutor would be very confident in retrying a case a second time and hoping to get a conviction.
I want to play another piece of sound from the jury foreperson, because she says that she was literally threatened when she went back into the jury room. Let's listen.
You guys keep saying a young black man. I don't see race. I just see a human being. And, you know, one particular person said to me, hey, if you were outside this courtroom, you would have gotten smacked out in the street for this.
Now, how about that? Might prosecutors or the judge want to investigate that as a possible crime on the part of a juror?
Yes and no. I can see why, from a non-legal standpoint, that might be considered a threat. But typically, threats are not conditioned. So if you say, if you were to do this, that's not a true threat by the law. And I think a defense attorney would say, this is a person giving an example as to how this conversation would have gone down outside of this setting. I think they may investigate a threat, but I don't think it would get past the legal threshold to make it one.
So his new trial starts next week. What do you think the prosecution needs to do to get a conviction? Really, they just need to not make any mistakes. It sounds like they've got a pretty overwhelming case against this guy.
Yeah, 9 out of 10 defense attorneys and prosecutors will tell you, Dan, that a retrial, if there's a flip of the coin as to who's more in favor of winning a retrial, it's always the prosecutor. Because by and large, a defense attorney's greatest asset is the element of surprise. Don't forget, Broward County during 2014 and 2015 had a whistleblower in terms of their DNA process saying that they were using incorrect samples. And so that would have been a great argument to bring in reasonable doubt at the first trial. But upon the second trial, the prosecutors are going to see that coming a mile away. They're going to re-interview their witnesses. They're going to make sure that, especially in this case, in jury selection, no one's considering the punishment, and then get to correct a lot of the mistakes or perceived mistakes they had at the first trial. And it should be a lot smoother for them come second trial.
And can they use against him now the fact that he tried to escape, sort of knowledge of guilt, consciousness of guilt?
Yeah, that might be a little bit difficult because it's a little bit remote in time. We may still have to go based on the initial ruling from the first trial. But of course, there's going to be more arguments that should come in. I think that'll be a difficult argument. Usually consciousness of guilt in flight is closer in time to the actual action. You stab someone, you flee the state or you flee the country. During criminal proceedings, I think there may be an argument, maybe not a successful one by the defense, that this is not consciousness of guilt, but something else because of the remoteness in time.
Right.
But I think it could be something that's on the table.
All right, Brian Buckmire, I know you're going to be covering this case and the retrial. I've really never heard of anything quite like this happening, just combination of why she said she couldn't reach a verdict once they're sitting out there in the jury box, and the fact that it happened. Amazing that it happened to you on your first trial. I've covered one case where I've seen it happen, and I've covered a lot of them. Brian, thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Up next, firing squads. We've seen them in movies, but now some inmates are arguing they would rather die that way than by lethal injection. So could the old school method be more humane? Some states are actually making it an option. Up next. Lethal injection has become the most utilized method in the country of executing death row inmates. Almost all of the 29 states that have the death penalty now use it. But now 2 death row inmates in Oklahoma are asking to go back to firing squads. Attorneys for Donald Grant and Gilbert Postel told a federal court in Oklahoma City yesterday that based on the drug cocktail used, their clients are at risk of severe pain and suffering if the state goes forward with that method of execution. Lawyers for the men offered a firing squad as a less problematic alternative. Grant and Postel are asking a judge to delay their upcoming executions until a trial can be held to decide whether Oklahoma's lethal injection method is constitutional. That trial is set to begin at the end of the month, but Grant is scheduled to be executed on January 27th for the murder of 2 hotel workers in 2001. Postel is set to be put to death on February 17th for 4 murders in 2005. The push to reassess Oklahoma's lethal injection methods came after a high-profile execution went awry last year. In October, John Marion Grant convulsed and vomited as he was put to death for a 1998 slaying of a prison cafeteria worker. It was the state's first execution in 6 years, following 3 consecutive botched executions or attempts in 2014 and 15. Now, all 4 of the flawed executions came after the state began using a particular sedative called midazolam during lethal injections. And lethal injections are typically performed using a 3-drug combination. It's an anesthetic to knock out the person, dull their pain, a paralytic, and then a toxic drug that stops their heart. But many pharmaceutical companies that make the anesthetic drugs won't sell the products for use in executions. The European Union has largely banned the export of a drug that was commonly used in executions in the U.S. as well. Last year, South Carolina became the 4th state to allow death row inmates to choose to die by firing squad. Though Utah is the only state to have used it in the last 50 years, they used it most recently in 2010. Here's how the firing squad works in Utah. The prisoner is strapped into a chair with a hood over the face and a target placed on the chest, right above the heart. A squad of sharpshooters, volunteers from a pool of corrections employees or law enforcement, carry out the execution. I'll admit, I was stunned when I saw that a firing squad is considered by some as a better way to die. Joining me now is Fordham University law professor and death penalty scholar, Deborah Denno. Thank you so much, Professor, for coming on the program. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, so we've long been told that lethal injection is a far more painless form of execution. Is that true?
It's not true. It's never been true. Lethal injection was first used in this country in 1982. And from the very beginning, from the very first lethal injection execution, every execution has been botched almost repeatedly after that point.
And yet I've been reading, and again, just for this segment, I was reading about how firing squads tend to be much more painless and much more, I don't want to call it efficient, but effective, efficient at achieving the goal.
They are more efficient. They're also more certain, and they've been used more. I mean, we've been using, of course, guns for the entire history of this country. But there was actually an experiment in 1938 on an inmate in Utah with his consent, and he had heart death within 15 seconds. Of the 3 modern firing squad executions that have taken place, and the last, as you said, was in 2010, they've gone off seemingly flawlessly.
So is the reason that firing squads aren't being used more just because of the spectacle kind of associated with it?
Well, and it is the spectacle associated with it in the public mind or in the minds that of commentators about it. It's actually been described as a very sterile process. It's usually in Utah, it's conducted in the same room as the lethal injection execution, but you don't see blood. Heart death, as I said, occurs very quickly, and modern experts have certainly testified to that. So it's what we think of when we think of somebody being shot on TV or in some movie or something like that.
Do you expect now that more states, as a result of this, the ones that do have the death penalty, are going to move towards firing squads instead of lethal injection?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know whether this is going to be something that attorneys will argue on their clients' behalf. Ironically, death penalty attorneys are being put in the position of having to argue an alternative method of execution to lethal injection. So that's something difficult legally. But number 2, the big irony here is because the firing squad is more humane, states may not want to use it. It's bad press for them for the reasons that you said at the beginning. It's associated with a more primitive, more violent culture, even though the actual executions are far more humane, far quicker, and far more reliable than any lethal injection.
Wow. All right, so interesting. And something I have to admit that I had not considered before, and my eyes have been opened, so to speak, about this. Professor Deborah Denno, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Country music superstar Morgan Wallen is the best-selling musical artist of all of last year. But some are still trying to effectively cancel him because of something he said and apologized for a year ago. Wallen joined country artist Ernest as a surprise guest on the stage of the respected Grand Ole Opry over the weekend. Almost immediately, the Twitter sphere lit up with people arguing that one of country music's most storied venues should not be giving its green light to a star who was caught using the N-word. Since then, Wallen has slowly been re-entering the spotlight as he gets ready for his sold-out tour, which starts next month. So his fans have forgiven him. Now look, country music has a lot of work to do when it comes to diversity. But at what point does the punishment period end for him for this infraction? For this person, he used an incredibly offensive word. He apologized, served time in the public penalty box. I've said before that I fear too many want the professional death penalty for anyone who does anything wrong. He's come out, publicly said, I was wrong, don't defend me, I'm educating myself, I want to do better. So the question I have, how long does he have to serve or sit out for critics to be satisfied? Joining me now is Nashville-based author and journalist Andrea Williams. She has written extensively about the country music industry. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so what do you think I'm missing here?
A whole lot of stuff, to be honest.
Tell me.
I think, first of all, I don't personally know of anyone who wants him canceled. I think that most people want him to fully take responsibility. And to be honest, we don't know that he's done that. We've seen his actions when he cares deeply about something, right? Like when there is the flood in Waverly, he hosts this benefit concert. He speaks out about this and does everything in his power to help these victims. Once it has become clear, and I think it's become really clear, it should have been at this point, about his connection to this industry and why it is so critical that he, as really the face of this industry right now, and as you mentioned, not just the biggest selling artist in country music last year, but the biggest selling artist across genre, that he stepped into this position to really push this industry forward post George Floyd. I think people are expecting to see more, and I think that's fair. Country music is not a meritocracy. And I don't think that's arguable, and we don't have to place that on a matter of race. It is not about who is putting out the best music. Everything here is artificial. So
let me ask you. Let me ask you just one follow-up question about something that you just mentioned about. Okay. It does sound like what you're saying is that he, despite whatever he did, despite his apologies, et cetera, that he should be responsible for the industry as a whole. And as a result, that he has that burden on him. And until he takes that burden on him, he shouldn't be forgiven? Or am I mischaracterizing what you said?
I'm saying that to whom much is given, much is required. And he is sitting at the top of this thing. And it's not just you're the biggest selling artist in the genre, and so we're expecting you to speak out about this industry's issues that have been persistent for 100 years. I'm saying you said the N-word. So clearly you are somehow complicit in this, right? Like his ability to do this and then still come out and not just sell records, but become, again, the biggest selling artist across genre speaks to these issues directly that country music is facing. You are at the top of this thing. You need to take responsibility for that, as he did, again, with something like these Waverly victims who had their homes flooded.
But tell me what that means in terms of taking responsibility. I mean, that's I guess, my concern. And again, I'm viewing this kind of through a legal prism, right, where I'm trying to figure out what's the crime, what's the proper sentence, when does it end, when can he move on, et cetera. And I guess I'm trying to figure out exactly what can he do that would lead you to say, okay, I'm ready, now we can accept him again.
Yeah. I think there is a lot of really low-hanging fruit that he just simply hasn't done, right? Like, for instance, you mentioned, or the clip mentioned, that he was out on stage with an artist named Ernest. And Ernest was actually a writer on the Dangerous Double album. He had something like 6 cuts. When the video first came out about him saying the N-word, Jason Isbell, who had a song that Morgan Wallen covered on the album, announced immediately that he was donating all of the proceeds from the money that he was making to the NAACP. We haven't heard anything like that from Morgan Wallen, from Ernest. Morgan Wallen has said that he was making these donations. There's been a lot of questioning about where the money has gone. We know it hasn't really at this point gone directly to this community that, again, has been directly impacted because of country music's long issues in the matter of race. I think there are ways, again, given the power of his platform, for him to push certain artists forward, for him to bring out artists as he's going about and doing shows. I think there are ways to, behind the scenes, maybe get in the room with songwriters and producers and people that are hurting because, again, these issues are not new in this industry. I know that there are people across the industry in these offices that if Morgan Wallen wants to take a meeting and Morgan Wallen wants to make something happen, if he wants to put together a fund or start some kind of nonprofit, it will happen and it can start to make change because that's how big he is.
So you are willing to forgive. You're just saying that he needs to do some more along the lines of what you just talked about. And if you see some of that, you are willing to say, okay, forgiven, understood, he has now paid his penance.
Yeah, so let me be really clear. I'm not saying that I haven't forgiven him on anything. I'm saying if we're talking about the lead into the segment is talking about this backlash because he showed up on the Opry stage on Saturday.
Yes.
So I'm talking primarily about why we are still seeing that at this point. Me as an individual, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just saying that you're making a fair point about something.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a personal issue here. I'm saying, again, as people in the Black community have had to accept that despite the N-word, his record sales go up, that when people say certain things on social media, speaking fairly and justifiably about how they feel about the situation, they're getting backlash from Morgan Wallen fans. People have to accept that. He's going to have to accept that this is going to be the environment right now until he does more. I mean, this man 6 months after the fact got on Good Morning America and said he hadn't really had time or hadn't sat and thought about the race issues in this industry. That's a big deal. So you got to expect and accept that as you come out, people are going to have something to say about it. And to the point about the Opry, that is going to rub off on you. You got a statement on your page that says the Opry is for everyone. And people are saying, I don't really know about that if you're letting this guy come out and he is not really showing how much he cares about how we feel about this situation.
Well, Andrea, look, the purpose of this show is to get different perspectives, and I appreciate yours and I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Still to come, all the major media outlets covered the accusations against Governor Andrew Cuomo, but they didn't report on a serious and relevant allegation against one of his accusers. Now a Washington Post columnist is stepping up and asking why. Well, when the right never liked you and the left turns on you, I think we know the answer. But we'll talk to Erik Wemple up next. It is no secret that former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo is not exactly a favorite these days of the political media. He made lots of enemies during his tenure, and hardly surprising that he doesn't get much benefit of the doubt, particularly given the allegations against him in the report from the New York Attorney General. But even though the right never liked him and the left has turned on him, that shouldn't mean that the media just ignore aspects of the story that don't favor the accepted narrative of the day. A column out this week from the Washington Post's Erik Wemple shows how the media did just that, leaving out key details about one of Cuomo's significant accusers. In his column, Wemple showed how the media ignored an important piece of information about Charlotte Bennett, the second woman to accuse former Governor Cuomo of sexual harassment. Bennett, a former aide to the governor, told the New York Times and CBS about an incident when she was alone with the governor in June of 2020. She claims Cuomo asked a series of invasive questions about her personal life and past romantic relationships. Bennett came forward on February 27th of last year, just 3 days after the first accuser, Lindsey Boylan, published an essay detailing her allegation. Media attention then skyrocketed after Bennett came forward. As the existence of a second accuser sort of established a pattern as far as the media was concerned. Immediately, Cuomo was essentially pegged as a serial harasser. Now, it turns out that back in 2017, a federal lawsuit accused Bennett of filing a false sexual misconduct accusation against a classmate at Hamilton College, something a guest on this show, Michael Tracy, alluded to during an appearance. The lawsuit alleged that Bennett filed the claim, quote, knowing it was false and knowing there was evidence of its falsity. The suit claimed there was even a recording in which Bennett admitted the man she accused did not harass her. The school settled the lawsuit on undisclosed terms. And yet, this information was nowhere to be found in coverage of the Cuomo scandal. The question now is, why? Erik Wemple, who is now, I'm sure, getting all sorts of hate tweets and emails, joins us now. Erik, thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Am I right about the response that you've gotten?
I haven't seen much hatred, I must say. I have not been the subject of any attacks for this. You might suppose that.
I'd look on Twitter. That's where I got that from. Okay. But anyway, why do you think the media turned its back on what would seem to be some very pertinent information here?
Well, as best I can tell, and thanks for reading the story and having me on, I really do appreciate it. As best I can tell, there seemed to be a scramble among media outlets to get the story of the next accuser, and the next one after that, and the next one after that. If you recall, the AG report had 11 women who alleged some form of sexual misconduct or another against the governor. Wasn't always sexual harassment, and again, these terms are sometimes very confusing and difficult, but sometimes it was touching, sometimes it was just creepy conversations that were being alleged. But in any case, it seemed as though the media was in an all-out scramble to get the story about this alleged tendency on part of the governor. And I don't believe that at any point did the media writ large, the sort of the Albany press corps extended, go back and look at, say, the last one, and dig a little deeper, look at the evidence that was out there, and really ask all the questions that needed to be asked about the allegations. I'm not saying that those allegations were necessarily flimsy or anything. All I'm saying, that all I tried to establish in what I wrote was that this information was relevant to the story, right? And that
and I've said before that I think the media is really bad at distinguishing the most serious kinds of sexual assault from creepy behavior, right? And I think that it does the sexual assault cases a grave disservice. I've done a whole segment on it on this show in the past. Now, the New York Times was the first to report on Bennett's allegation. You noted in your column that they made mention of Bennett's history of activism of sexual misconduct at Hamilton College, but they didn't mention this lawsuit where she was accused of making a false claim. Did your reporting indicate that they knew about this lawsuit before they published her allegation?
What I take from the New York Times response was that they did not know about this suit before or as they published their story. They found out about it afterwards from an anonymous tipster. You might say, oh, that's inexcusable for the New York Times, but you do have to consider that the accuser, in this case, Charlotte Bennett, was not identified by name in that lawsuit, nor was she a defendant in the suit. So if you did a legal search, it might have been difficult to come up with that. The question then for the New York Times became, do you do a story, sort of a separate story on the suit, or just roll it into the continuing coverage? That's a call, of course, for the New York Times. We know what call they made. They never mentioned the suit. But it's also a question for the broader Albany press corps, which is, why didn't anybody pick this up? And nobody.
It's not just Albany. But Erik, it's not just Albany. Yeah, you know true. That. This is the national press corps, because this story has been bubbling around for a long time. No one wants to touch it. They don't want to touch it because they're afraid of getting criticized. They're afraid of people going after them.
I asked the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other outlets about this. So yes, I did a national sort of reporting survey on this.
Right.
Yes.
Erik Wemple.
One quick final thought. It wasn't necessarily only that these news organizations didn't write up this lawsuit. They didn't even contact the lawyer who represented the plaintiff to ask him about it. So there was no curiosity.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, in terms of media critics, et cetera, I want to point out that we had Chris Cuomo up on the screen there for a minute. That's not who we were talking about today. So anyway, Erik Wemple, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Coming up, Dr. Anthony Fauci. He is so polarizing, but is he just a scapegoat? Zoom into the show tomorrow. Tell me what you think about that. Reach out to us at newsnationnow.com/DAL, Dan Abrams Live. I want to discuss and debate it with you live. Coming up, a woman steps out of the shower only to be startled by a man outside her house holding a gun. He makes his way inside. When officers arrive, he starts taunting them. More of this unbelievable body cam video is up next. We're on scene with body cam from the Phoenix police showing the dangers officers face every day. Terrifying 911 call from a woman who just got out of the shower and found a man breaking into her home.
Phoenix 911, what is your emergency?
Somebody's in my backyard with a gun.
What's the address
Somebody right now. Get out of my house! Get out of my house!
What is your address there?
Get me out with a gun, please! Oh, please!
The woman, who was wearing only a towel at the time, was able to escape through a window. She was not harmed. The police took the woman to safety as they tried to get the suspect to surrender. Two officers positioned themselves just beyond the backyard using a block wall to protect themselves. The suspect, Anthony Greco, walked back from the home into the yard, still with gun in hand.
Do you have any weapons? Put the gun down! Put the gun!
Officer Warren Jackson fired one round from his rifle, hitting Greco, who died at the scene. The Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office is reviewing the incident. Investigators later discovered that 2 days before the incident, Greco kidnapped a family member at gunpoint, stole their car and a gun. Greco then used the car and gun during this break-in. The family member was released after giving debit cards to Greco and was not hurt. Joining me once again, Sean Sticks Larkin, retired Tulsa police lieutenant. Sticks, good to see you. So this was a terrifying situation for the woman in the home. Talk to me about the police tactics, though, and the use of that wall there.
You know, watching this entire video, there's not one thing that I could critique the officers that responded to this call on. From a tactical, training type of scenario or anything like that, this is literally textbook. They have their victim out of the house. She is interviewed by them. She actually provides a photo of the suspect that she took before he got in. And she says, there's nobody else in the house but my dogs. So the officers do what's called a contain and call out. And exactly that. They surround the house. They put people at different corners, basically to keep the suspect inside. And nothing but time is on their side to try to talk to the suspect and get him to surrender peacefully.
Yeah, we heard this. We heard the suspect tell police to shoot him before police say he raised his weapon and the officer opened fire. I want to, because you may have missed that in the first time. Let's play that again.
Do you have any weapons? Put the gun down! Put the gun!
Now, clearly, the suspect had no intention of giving himself up.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the officer that's positioned there with that rifle, he's behind a cinder block wall. He's basically got ballistic cover. Even though, those type of walls are oftentimes hollow inside, they will actually stop most bullets from penetrating through to the officer. And the suspect, he comes out with a gun down to his side. The officer gives him verbal commands, an opportunity to surrender peacefully. And then the suspect does make the statement, shoot me. He raises the firearm in the direction of the officers. That results in, the deadly force. And, the video continues on when the officers go around to the back. They've got a ballistic shield. They're using less lethal. They've got, deadly force. Someone's making commands to the person while he's down. Again, from a tactical type of scenario, these officers did every single thing perfectly.
Well, and you don't say that lightly, because I know that when you and I talk about this, you will often have critiques or things that you think that the officers could have done differently, et cetera. Sean Six Larkin, as always, thank you for coming on the program. Appreciate it.
Every time, Dan. Thank you.
That does it for us tonight. Up next, new pictures in the agonizing search for little Harmony Montgomery. That's coming on News Nation Prime with Marnie Hughes, which starts right now. Thank you for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.